Just let us know.
All right, and I just started the recording.
Okay, good.
And I'm hyperactive, so I move around a lot.
Well, we welcome leaders of the Florida Education Association for this meeting, which you folks had requested. We have some questions, but we want to leave the floor open first for you to, if you want to tell us anything that you have in mind. This is your agenda.
Well, when we requested this, we did not know that education was going to become front and center in the gubernatorial race. We're happy about that because the way we look at it is much of the last 15 years, the teacher's input has not been sought in determining educational policy and the reforms that have been implemented. And we see that as a very troubling. So we're hoping that as we get past November, in the next session of the legislature, things can change and we can start really talking about what's best for kids as we move forward. Testing is a major issue. You've got one school district now looking at opting out of the state testing, which is Lee County. At the most recent Palm Beach County School Board meeting, that school board also had some conversation about looking at what are the consequences for districts that opt out of the state testing program. I don't think anyone fully understands the answer to that question at this point. There are some things that come to mind immediately, but punishment for not taking the test hasn't really been on the radar screen for the legislature. Funding is always an issue. It's still an issue. We still haven't gotten back to our high level mark in the 2007-08 school year. Florida was hit hard by the recession, we understand that, but as the economy is now turning around, investments in education are a must. We have to fund the base student allocation, which is part of the FEFP formula. We should be implementing the class size amendment the way the voters intended on 2 occasions. PICO funding has not been going to public schools at the level it needs, and PICO funding probably needs to be examined in general because it's a funding source that is on the decline because of utilizing antiquated technology. Fewer and fewer people have landlines, and that's how the majority of the funds get to the PICO account. When the state does have a good program, they tend not to fund it. And an example is originally we looked at the lowest performing elementary schools in the state, and we took 100 of them, did not fully fund that. And then this past year they expanded it from the lowest 100 to the lowest 300 and provided no funding. You cannot extend the student day by 1 hour without funding. There are costs involved, and the state just didn't do that. We have technology needs. We have old schools that need to be retrofitted. We have new schools that still need to have enough computers in order to be able to do everything that we're asking kids to do on a computer. We're developing tests, which for every course at every grade level, which most of which are going to be done by computer, and yet we don't have the technology to actually do it. We don't have the wiring, we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the equipment. It's not uncommon for media centers to be closed in schools because that's the only place where you have a sufficient number of computers in order to be able to have kids take tests. We test somewhere in this state, depends on the school district, between 80 and 100 days out of the year, some kids are taking a standardized test, which means most of the school year the media center is closed. So kids do not have the ability to go in and do research projects and things like that.
And also just To piggyback on that, Andy, is when we're talking about the computers and the lack and the retrofitting, last school year we had the debacle where kids were taking the FCAT. The system crashed, so their entire test was gone, and they had to start again the next day. My personal kid, that happened to him. So if we're making these high-stakes tests and then the system can't sustain it, that's really not fair to the students.
We can relate to that occasionally in the newspaper industry, unfortunately.
Well, it's very frustrating as an adult to have the computer crash. I can't imagine being a kid and having it happen and then have to start a test that you probably didn't want to take to begin with all over, unless it could be retrieved. Some of them were retrieved, but very few of them were.
Yeah, his was not retrieved.
So it is a problem. We have been advocating wraparound services for schools. Jones High School here, I think, is an example of how it can be done, where you coordinate community resources to provide services to kids, to make sure that their health needs are met, their dental needs, vision. There's quality before school and after school programs, activities that are academically focused to help expand the regular school day, but also activities to keep kids engaged in something positive. I taught kindergarten, and I've also taught sixth graders. The law doesn't allow you to leave little kids alone, but you could trust little kids on their own. Sixth graders, that's not so much. They've got to have something to do. They go home to an empty house. Kids are going to get in trouble if there's not something constructive. Even the best kids are tempted to do things to test how far they can go. So if they're not involved in programs after school until the parents or grandparents are able to be there, we get difficulties that we could avoid. So I think, after school programs, in addition to athletics, are things that can help kids learn quite a bit. Athletics is an important part of the program. Kids learn working in a team. They learn how to get along with one another. There's a natural pecking order on a football team, for instance, that you got the captain and everybody looks up to the captain. I mean, there are skills that are taught well beyond just having athletics and getting exercise. So I think after-school programs and before-school programs are extremely important because kids can be home 2-3 hours unsupervised. Early childhood education, including pre-K, is extremely important. One of the things that we see is we're starting academics earlier and earlier. Kindergartners are now expected to read. So we're missing the normal activities of a kindergarten classroom, which were to learn socialization, learning how to get along with one another, learning their skills in a fun way, being able to identify an uppercase letter and a lowercase letter, matching them up through games and puzzles, being able to identify a number of objects with the symbol for that number. Those things we worked on in a very fun way. Now that's all supposed to happen before they get there. So pre-kindergarten is even more important now than ever before. And having the opportunity to just have somebody read to a child is extremely important. I believe in Orange County we did a First Books event where through the American Federation of Teachers, I know we did it in Osceola, I was there, where you give kids books to take home so that kids who might not have a book in their home actually have something in their hands that they can look at. Because even for a toddler, there's a skill in whether the books turn the right side up or wrong way. It doesn't really matter before they can read. What matters is being able to turn the pages and having that eye-hand coordination help. One of the things that we've seen that's very troubling is the major expansion of poverty in Florida. What you see on the map that we just gave you is in red the places that exceeded 20% in 2000, and virtually the entire state in 2012 is red. About 1 in 4 children in Florida also live in poverty, which poverty does play into what we're talking about. When families are working more than one job, that takes away from family time, and it's not easy getting along. So we need an investment in trying to lower the poverty rate. There are effects of poverty that need to be overcome in schools all over the place. It's not isolated to urban areas. I've said many times the only difference between urban poor and rural poor are how many buildings you have and how tall they are. The effects are still there, and we need to try and address those. And wraparound services. Yes.
Jones High School's in
Jones.
Orlando.
Yeah, it's kind of down the street.
Did you want to talk about that in wraparound schools? The wraparound services there? Did you guys know about Jones High School?
He did a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, they have a, like, I sat through a presentation one time. The Boys and Girls Club actually has a tutoring program at Jones High School. The Y has helped with athletic programs, which are extremely important.
They were triple F, right?
Yes.
Triple F.
Triple F, and they were able to
Right.
raise the grade. In Osceola County, I want to say West Side K-8, it's off of 192 in a neighborhood that appears to be around $200,000 homes when you drive through it. They have a huge number of homeless children, and not homeless in terms of being on the street, but their families live in a hotel. And I've been there twice, I believe, and we did through the American Federation of Teachers, we did a program last spring where we gave kids backpacks with school supplies and food. There was after-school arts and crafts programs. There again was a first book activity where kids were given books. When you talk to the kids, it's extremely impressive. They're not afraid one-on-one to tell you exactly what their situation is like. Where they talk about dad couldn't go to work for a week because they couldn't afford the part for the car for him to be able to go to work. Those things have an impact, yet some kids are able to break out of that mold academically, and they function at a very high level. Other kids need a little more push and help, and I think that's not what we're doing in Florida. We identify a problem, but we don't really invest in trying to fix the problem. From our point of view, it's a lot of blame. It's a lot easier to blame teachers, to blame the schools, blame the parents, as opposed to trying to help and bring the community together to try and address the issues and provide programs through public-private partnerships. I think Jones High School is an example of something that we can look at where it shows us that there is a path to changing it. I've been to Jones several times. The kids in the beginning were very demoralized by the letter grade. I can remember the first trip I went there leaving, and it was the most depressing thing was the kids believed they were failures. And that's something that we have to try and figure a path toward trying to change. I think I hit on a lot.
Yeah, I think you got it.
Okay, great. You said something toward the beginning of your presentation about how in the last 16 years the state hadn't really consulted with teachers on education policy. I assume you're including January 2007 through January 2011 in that time period. What makes you think former Governor Christ, if he were elected, that things would be any different under him in the next 4 years.
I would say that would be accurate in the beginning of his first term. But a few months to a year into it, he did start asking questions, and we did develop a relationship where he would, at least in the beginning, it was just telling us what he was getting ready to do, and we would give him a reaction, and then once he realized our reaction really did reflect the views of our membership, he did start talking to us more. We had a lot of consultations. Of the 3 governors that I've worked with in the time I've been at FEA, I can tell you we spent more time with Governor Christ than we did with the other 2 combined. He genuinely, in my opinion, he genuinely wants to help. He's willing to listen to people. He's willing to change his view based on the data that other people can provide him. If he finds that his original opinion does not match what the real life data shows him. So I think he's very smart in his approach, and he does look for people to come together, and he did in the last 2.5 to 3 years of his first term.
But as in Governor Scott also extended an olive branch. I recall he had a teachers summit in South Florida, was it last year sometime, when he was soliciting teachers' input?
Well, we had, with Governor Scott, we had an initial dinner at the mansion, and then it was just a small little group of teachers, and then we were invited back to a larger group function. And then a couple meetings in his office. He did have the summit, but I wouldn't. Well, Joanne participated in
right.
that,
I participated in the summit. He did not attend the summit. So if it's your education summit and it's your high priority, one would think that he would at least make an appearance to hear what we had to say. Much of it was directed work that had been predetermined. They weren't really looking for change or outcome. They were looking for something to validate what they had already done. And so for us, we were the naysayers in the group, and we talked about the things that didn't work and things that we should talk about and change and move an agenda. Alberto Cavallo, the superintendent from Miami-Dade, spoke strongly in the same regards that we did, that we shouldn't be debating the standards. We already know what the standards are. We should be talking about how schools are graded and that it's not done appropriately, and that we've had so many changes in the school grading system and nothing long enough to see if anything worked, and we're just going to change cut scores to make a grade here and there and make a community happy isn't the right thing to do for schools, that we should be talking about how we should be getting into schools and making a difference. So from our perspective, I did a little bit of a blog every day and gave my perspective, and I felt very much that we were asked to be there to give a stamp of approval of something that had already occurred. And as is our normal stance, we'll speak out and talk out against things that we think aren't accurate, and I did. And there were a couple of us in the room that did the same thing.
Well, you've mentioned that you're giving Chris credit for changing during his term. It looks like Governor Scott, if you take seriously his latest proposal to put another $700 million into schools, it looks like Governor Scott is in the process of change. So why not give him credit for the same process?
He had an opportunity this last legislative session to do a major investment. We could have gotten back to the high watermark, and he chose not to. Once again, he went down the path of tax cuts as opposed to investing in education. He had a sufficient amount of money this year and chose not to. So if you use that as a barometer of what you can predict for the future, I don't know if it's a serious proposal or if it's a campaign ploy. I hope that it would be a serious proposal. But he also proposed Medicaid expansion and then did not really follow through in the legislative process in order to make that a reality. So just because he's throwing out a number there, that doesn't mean the legislature is actually going to follow suit.
And in his history, he has never come out this early before a legislative session to talk about anything like that before. So for us, it is a little bit, we are looking at it a little skeptical that he can read the polls as well as we can read the polls, and that this is a way that he could maybe garner teacher support. But our teachers are pretty angry. They're pretty angry about a lot of things that are taking place all over this state. The high-stakes testing, Senate Bill 736 with the evaluation system, the loss of everybody becoming from July 1 an annual contract teacher, that everything is going to be based on high-stakes testing. We are changing standards. We are changing a test that is being field tested in Utah, because we all know that Utah population looks so much like the Florida population that we're going to be very sure that that test is valid. So there are a lot of things out there that he could have done already to make a difference, but he has just turned a deaf ear and just moved an agenda that he wanted to move. And now that we're into an election cycle, and how many days? 69 days? Is that what they said
Something
on the news?
like that.
69 days before the general. Now we're going to change our stance. And so for us, it's we're not gonna fall for a ploy. We're gonna wait and see.
And the validation of the test is extremely important. There are some that believe that standardized tests in general have a white middle class bias. So if you don't test, when you field test, you're testing the actual questions, not whether you're going to get the right results or not, but you're testing whether the questions are valid. So unless you have a population that looks like Florida testing those questions, you could be getting a false test score when it comes to the end, because having where I taught in Jacksonville, there are certain words that some kids don't know, not through no fault of their own. It's just not something that's in common with the way they've been brought up and where they're brought up. So if you don't weed out those words, that some kids are going to have a lower score just because of the way the question was worded. So that's why the validation is important.
And it's cultural, it's dialect a little bit. I'm a speech language pathologist, so when I would give a test, and on the test it says, where do you live? In the community that I taught, I had a very high population of minority students that were 75 to 80% were free and reduced lunch, single families. When I said, where do you live? They couldn't pick the picture of the house. If I said, where do you stay? They would show me the house every time. That's the kind of thing that you have to be able to discern that probably folks in Utah aren't going to discern for the kids in Florida. I mean, it's just that simple of a thing.
And actually, that's the exact same example that I would use.
Well,
having
because
taught
my
with
kids would have been the same kind of
taught kindergartners in Jacksonville.
Right. Where do you stay? They get
when
it.
you did the initial dial testing, which is what we did in those days, that was the question that every kid got wrong. And then when I talked to one of the teachers that had more experience than I did, she said, ask them a different way. And it was, show me a picture of where you stay, and every kid got it right. So that's why it's important to have the tests validated with a population that really is us, because we are one of the most diverse states there are, and becoming more and more diverse every year. And Orlando is ground zero for a major shift in population. I think Orlando's slated to become the largest city in the state in the not too distant future, and it will be similar experience to what South Florida has been going through, which is a good thing.
You mentioned that Governor Scott could read the polls, but can't he also read the tea leaves, in that business interests here in the state are emphasizing the importance of strengthening our education system because it's an economic impact here. So even if you're unsure about his pattern of holding to his promises, do you think that the pressure from the business interests are going to force him to enhance the investment in education here?
Well, I would hope that he would invest in education, and I would hope that he would stop creating a parallel system. We have expanded vouchers. We are continuing to expand vouchers. We talk about vouchers all the time. They're clearly unconstitutional. We won a lawsuit in 2006 stating that vouchers were unconstitutional. But every term we go, we're looking at creating more voucher programs. We're looking for more opportunity scholarships. We're looking for ways to divert money that should go into the general revenue to shore up public schools for everyone as a way of giving tax credits. So if we really care about our most precious resource, which are our children, and making sure that every student gets a leg up, public education is the way to do that, because public education is the only place that takes every student from every walk of life, no matter what their disability, no matter where they start, no matter what their socioeconomic status is, and we move them the best that we can. So our public school students and our public school parents, they want the same things that voucher parents want. They want a safe school. They want small class sizes. They want a curriculum that's rich and meaningful. They want the arts. They want music, PE, all those things that are being dwindled and cut out of public schools because we are hamstrung to these high stakes tests and lack of funding. So if we truly care about making productive citizens and giving everybody a shot of the American dream, then by golly, then let's do what we should be doing. They have a paramount duty, the Florida legislature, to fund public schools, not voucher programs, not specialty things, public schools. And if they care about that, and if they take their duty seriously, then they would fund us appropriately. They would listen to us that work in the schools and make a difference. There is not a teacher in this state that wants a bad teacher in front of their students. There's not a teacher in this state that wakes up every day and says, how can I screw up these kids today? They go to work every day to do what's best for kids. So free up the red tape for us. Let us teach and let us get kids in a productive mode so that we can send business what they need. And the way that we're doing the system, the way we've done it for the last 15 years of high-stakes testing, is not getting it done.
I got to follow up on that. I mean, the people, the advocates of the current accountability system will point to all kinds of rankings, like an Education Week. That's one that I can think of that appear to show us doing better at making steady gains since the A+ program was adopted.
Sure.
So they would say that to use a phrase, it is working.
And then I would just ask you this. Is it really working, or are we creating kids that can really bubble in tests really well and answer specific questions to meet the needs to make a statistic?
There's a way to teach kids to take tests better.
And so let's really look at that. We have so narrowed the focus of what we're doing in public schools. We are not teaching kids to critically think. We are losing those kinds of things. We are so on to math and reading, and not that that's not important, but there is so much more to life than math and reading that we should be expanding that so that our public schools are the best they can be. So, and then I also want to point out, you said accountability in that, and I want to be very clear. Teachers are not afraid of accountability. We do believe in accountability, and we do believe that you have to have standards, absolutely. But it's about how you're going about to make that change, to make a difference in a kid's life that matters. We should be looking, as the FCAT was originally designed, it was never intended to be a high-stakes test. It was supposed to be a diagnostic tool where you would give the child the test, see where they were, and develop your teaching and learning and curriculum based on where the kids were, because kids are at all different levels and you have to reach them all. So you want to know where they are so that you can move them from point A to point B. Because if a kid is 2 grade levels below, let's all be serious. In 1 year's time span, as the former governor would tell you, they should magically become on grade level. That's not practical and that's not probable. But if you move them a certain amount, and then every year are moving them a certain amount, or lengthen the school day or lengthen the school year so that they are able to catch up and start moving. That's progress, and that's what we should be doing and talking about with students. Because not everybody is going to college. And we don't want everybody going to college. We need plumbers, we need electricians, we need diesel mechanics, which my son is becoming, which I'm happy about. We need those types of things. So not everybody is college bound, not everybody should be college bound, and we should be preparing students for the career that they want. We used to have a school to work program.
Mm-hmm.
That funding's gone by the wayside, and we're not doing that. It's all about high stakes testing, moving kids through to what they believe would be community college or 4-year university, which isn't the track everybody's going. That's not realistic.
And the business community supported the current system. So if they're not getting the workers that they believe they should be, they're part of the issue here. They created the environment where we're focused solely on tests, which is an isolated activity. Very few people work in isolation anymore. Most of it's teamwork. That's why the move to what used to be called Common Core standards, now it's the Florida standards, is extremely important, because it's going, if we were to implement it correctly, it would be creating an environment where kids will work in cooperative groups, where they'll have projects and be responsible for each other, and they'll be able to give each other assignments, hold each other accountable, so that there are some results for the group. The skills that we're looking at in there's probably some that the critics are correct or probably not age appropriate or shouldn't be in there. But when you have a volume that's several inches thick of standards, you're actually going to have some in there that probably shouldn't be. So that's not unusual, and they need to be weeded out as you go forward and identify them.
But you need to stick with it long enough where you can find which ones should be weeded out and how to do that. And then the other piece is, as we're moving from one set of standards to another set of standards, FCAT's gone, new test is coming. Nobody's prepared for what's really going to take place from that. Because you're going to have a dip in scores because you're moving from a different set of standards, you're taking a different test. Nobody's fully prepared or fully ready to implement all of those changes at once. Teachers have been given awareness training, and that's what it really is. It's an awareness training. Now, if you ask the Florida Department of Education, they will tell you they have trained thousands of teachers all over this state, and they're prepared for Florida standards, which we call Common Core. But what they really created was they've given an awareness of what the standards are, not really how to implement them and what the difference is and how you should really be teaching them differently. So we're going to see a dip in test scores. That's going to be a given. And I want to be real clear, our students suddenly did not get dumber overnight, and our teachers did not suddenly stop teaching. It's going to be the difference in the standards and the difference in the test. And we are not prepared. The public's not prepared for that. Parents aren't prepared for that. And I'm going to tell you, I don't believe school districts are going to be prepared for that fallout, because that's exactly what happened in New York.
And the state had a move to try and hold some people harmless in this, but they didn't really take a serious look at it. Those test results, when they plummet, will have an effect on the school grade. It will have an effect on the district grade. It's going to have an effect on the teacher evaluation. It's going to have an effect on promotion from 3rd grade to 4th grade. It's going to have an effect on whether kids can graduate or not. Those things are real life, and they're happening, and we didn't build in any safeguards for the switch. We had advocated during the session that we have a 3-year moratorium on all of this to give people an opportunity to move from one system to the other. Not stop, continue to do it, but just use it as an advisory to see where we have gone wrong. Because most of the teachers that are teaching right now have gone through the system as it was created Now you're asking them to change completely their whole method of teaching to a whole new standard where it is more critical thinking, which is a good thing, but it's going to take time for the adjustment. There's no money for teachers to go out and buy the materials that you're going to need to have the types of activities the new standards look for. So you're really at the mercy of the economic status of that teacher. I'm in somebody's class who can't afford to go out and buy materials. I'm going to suffer. The school district, through the state, ought to be providing the materials for those teachers and not relying on whether someone, as I refer to it all the time, someone who married well and married someone who has a lot of money. She can most likely she can spend the money in her classroom, where someone like me, when I was a beginning teacher, I was living on every dime I was making. I didn't have a lot of cash to spend in my classroom. The district should be providing that. So we need some time to make these adjustments, give teachers time to gather the materials that they need, give kids an opportunity to move to a different level. I use myself as an example many times. I'm the kid that we went through reading and we stopped phonics and then there wasn't any. I'm also the kid that went from arithmetic to modern math and kind of got lost in that translation too. It takes time for kids to actually make adjustments from one type of environment to another, and Florida just once again missed the opportunity, all because we have this goal that a former governor's plan is more important than what happens with kids.
And that goes back to your question about Governor Scott. We lobbied him hard about the moratorium and asked him to get out there and help us with the legislature about that, and he chose not to do that.
When you began this conversation, Andy, you rattled off a list of woes in the state here, and I'm wondering what, if anything, got accomplished in this past legislative session that was on your agenda.
Not much. Most of what we have been doing the last several years is preventing really bad stuff, and you spend all your time fighting against things as opposed to trying to accomplish good things. At one point in this state, we had accomplished a reduction in class size for over 800 courses. We have seen in the last few years a heavy backpedaling on that. We're down to around 300 classes covered by the class size amendment. So we have kids sitting in chemistry classes that are so large that it's really unsafe to do experiments. You've got kids in a variety of programs that should be covered by the class size, but we haven't. The state, we're interested in just living from session to session, kicking the can as far as you can, hoping you're putting the problem off. And you know, that may be a result of term limits. Politicians work in cycles of what their political life is, and if they're not ever going to be around long enough to actually get blamed for the outcome of an idea that they had, they're not real interested in solving it. We had a bill that on wraparound services, which was to model after Jones High School's success, develop pilots around the state to let's see if it really works, if it's a lasting program. Representative Rangel was a sponsor. Unfortunately, last night was not real good to him. But his bill never really got heard. There was a committee meeting where some of the partners from Jones High School came to Tallahassee and testified. The representative was called to the side and told, we'll put something in the budget for you, but we don't really want to vote on your bill. And then when it got time for the budget, there was no cash for it. Those kinds of things happen all the time. It's like I think I said earlier, we're real good at identifying a problem in terms of the Florida legislature, and casting blame, but there's very little activity to really try and solve it. And that's the. I can say that Senator Gates had an idea of a career path where kids could get certification in a career in high school, so that they could really start on it and then go to the college level or a trade school with that knowledge, or go directly to get a job. That's an alternative that really needs to be expanded and we need to invest in. But unless it becomes a politician's pet project, and even then, we only tinker with it. We don't really invest heavily in trying to make something happen. It's troubling.
You mentioned Representative Rangel losing yesterday, or alluded to that. One of the things I'm sure that you know that happened here in Orange County was that voters easily extended a half-penny sales tax to build and renovate and upgrade schools. You mentioned that the reductions in PICO funding. Is that an alternative, a viable alternative to state funding for school construction, that local counties, local districts make the case to voters and get alternative funding?
I think it's an option that we have to utilize now in absence of the legislature doing something different. But I think what we're going to find as we go down this road, that we have created rich districts and poor districts. Because Pinellas County, for instance, has a referendum to provide money for teacher salaries and for art education. That was passed 2 years ago. I think it was a redo,
Yeah, 'cause it was before
an
that.
extension on it. Palm Beach has one that's on the ballot in November that's also to continue, that is for arts education.
Monroe County has one.
Monroe, Sarasota, Alachua. What we're getting is pockets of places are able to find new revenue sources, and other pockets aren't. So you're going to destabilize the value of the FEFP. Florida has the best funding formula in terms of trying to create fairness.
Right.
And now what we're doing is we're destabilizing that. Because Monroe County,
right.
property values there, once they recover, which, having received my tax bill, I can see that the property values are recovering, at least as far as the tax assessors are concerned. Monroe County could afford to do whatever they want with just the nature of the property, where Gadsden County, for instance, probably can't. And the FEFP formula was supposed to prevent that from happening. Although I think until we correct the state's deficiency, I think it's great that communities come together to raise an investment for what they believe is needed.
Earlier this year, Florida released the value-added data on teachers to news outlets. Do you think that was a mistake?
Absolutely. It's a work in progress. We're not finished trying to figure it out on whether it works or not. The value-added formula is extremely complicated. When they showed it to me the first time, I have to admit I did not know that was a mathematical formula. It looked like gibberish to me. Yet it's supposed to factor out and factor in all the appropriate things. You know, if I can't understand it, and I'm very reluctant to just believe what the Department of Education says, how do I know it works? From what I hear, the number of people that believe that their scores weren't even in the calculations. You had problems with the student rosters. There were a lot of potential errors in that. It was released prematurely. Down the road, if we continued to use the VAM formula down the road, if we can prove it is actually valid and we have all the mechanisms in there in terms of I know what you've done is my kids that I taught and not somebody else's, then maybe it's appropriate to use for a portion of the teacher's evaluation. We're using it for 50%. The research shows somewhere between 20 and 30% may be the appropriate number. So we're heavily invested in it in Florida when it may not pan out. Also, because at that point we didn't test every student in every subject at every grade level like we will be in the future, I may never have seen the kid that created my score because of what I taught.
Or
So
you
I-
might have seen the kid, but you might have not have taught him that
subject, correct, because they did change the law to say you had to have at least seen the kid. So if I'm teaching French, I didn't teach the kid the thing that's grading me. Somebody else did, and we're in federal court over all that.
Speaking of lawsuits, a federal judge in May ruled against your challenge of the state's method of evaluating teachers. What's your next move?
We're appealing it.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the appeal right now. Somewhere in the fall, we're
Yeah.
hoping.
Right.
We don't have another hearing set.
It moves extremely slow. You're going to negatively impact teachers before the judicial system can actually come up with a remedy.
Right, so we have that piece out there, and then we have the lawsuit on Senate Bill 850, which we filed a summary judgment, and we have been assigned a judge, and we have a date in it's going to be in September.
We expect it to be the first couple of weeks of
September.
September for hearing, and our judge is Chief Justice Charles Francis for that one.
Now, that's the
Log
school.
rolling.
That's
The voucher.
yes, the school voucher expansion.
Right, but what
yeah.
we filed the lawsuit on was that they log rolled it the last day
Okay.
into Senate Bill 850, which
So-
says it has to be a single title,
All right.
clearly defined, and when they added it in at the last, it doesn't clearly, the title is education, and they added a whole bunch of stuff in. It was 140 pages, of which both those measures failed. Both those measures went through the correct process of committee hearings, testimony, going through both chambers, and they both failed independently the day before. So how they resurrected them was tying them into this bill that was already in place in a 140-page amendment the last day of session. We believe that what they did was unconstitutional, and we're asking a judge to invalidate the law.
So you have a procedural objection to how the law was passed, but based on what you said earlier, it sounds like you have substantive objections to the concept.
We do.
Now, one of the big advocates of that, you may know, is one of our local lawmakers, who's going to be the Senate President, Andy
correct.
Gardner. Andy is a big advocate of education for kids with special needs, and the way he's portrayed this is that this is a measure to provide more help to kids with special needs, and why would anyone want to stand in the way of providing more help to kids with special needs?
Our point on the whole thing is the Florida legislature, including Senator Gardner, must follow the Constitution. If we're teaching our children to follow the laws of the land and the Constitution, so should the Florida legislature. And so we're going to stand up because we believe it was unconstitutional. If they want to talk about how to help students with disabilities, I'd be glad to sit down and have a conversation with the senator about that. As an SLP, I worked with special needs students every day, all day, and I certainly understand what special needs students need. I have lots of concerns about how that bill, what it talks about in that bill. They're talking about that these are, they apply for these scholarships. They can use them for services. It will be not through the school system. It will go through the agency that oversees disabled folks. We know that agency is already underfunded and understaffed? Who's going to ensure that these students are getting the services they need? How are we sure that the services that these students are being provided are done by certified, accountable therapists? If you're talking about speech therapists, if you're talking about occupational therapists, if you're talking about behavior specialists, we want to make sure that those funds are actually being used for those students, because part of that bill says that they can then stockpile the money that's not used for college, and it doesn't necessarily, I think that stayed in that bill. I don't know, I shouldn't say that. It was in the original bill. I don't know if it ended in the amended bill, because it was 140 pages, where they could then use that money for other students, other children in their family that may not even have special needs. So we have lots of concerns about that. But if the Senate President would like to have a conversation with us about how we think that that could be handled, we certainly would welcome that conversation with the incoming president, absolutely.
And the legislature's reduced ESE funding over the last
By
several
14%.
years. I mean, so if you're really concerned, or
You should be concerned about making sure that there's enough ESE funding in the public schools that they can get those services. I did have a little bit, I was on a radio talk show and debated the gentleman from Step Up From Students, John East, and they had a family on of an autistic child who was homeschooled, and they talked about that they would be using those funds for speech therapy and behavior therapy, and I also reminded them that according to the law, even if students are homeschooled and they qualify for those services, they can take them to the public schools and have speech therapy, behavior specialists, etc. Because as a SLP, I had many students on my caseload that were homeschooled students where the parents brought them to me. As long as they meet the state guidelines and the qualifications, they certainly are, those services are available to them according to federal law, of which districts will do.
We're just about the end of our hour. I think we could have our own all-day summit here if we wanted. Is there anything that you wanted to leave us with that we didn't ask you about?
well, I think we hit on the waterfront.
We appreciate the time.
Okay, we appreciate your coming in. Thanks a lot.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.